Welcome to week 3 of your public speaking class. This video is going to be a brief video about language. And to talk about language and the role of language in public speaking, we need to go back to ancient Rome. Ancient Romans studied and taught rhetoric, divided its study and processes into 5 canons: invention, disposition, style, memory, and delivery. The term style does not refer to clothing, but language choices. Should a public speaker use very basic language because the audience is unfamiliar with his topic or her topic? Or more technical language with many acronyms, abbreviations, and jargon because the audience may have experience and expertise in this topic? Or maybe it's an academic audience you're connecting to, and academic language with abstract vocabulary or flowery poetic language with lots of metaphors. Maybe you've never thought of those questions, but they are the ones that influence both the clarity of the message as well as the credibility a speaker will gain during the presentation. Too many times I've seen speakers treat language as an add-on to the ideas and structure of the speech, but language is far too complex and foundational aspect of our lives for us to consider it as an afterthought for a speech. Language is any formal system of gestures, signs, sounds, and symbols used or conceived as a means of communicating thought through written, enacted, or spoken means. Let me say that again for us. Language is a formal system of gestures, signs, sounds, and symbols that are used or conceived as a means of communicating thought, either through written, enacted, or spoken means. Linguists believe that there are over 6,900 languages and distinct dialects spoken in the world today. The language spoken by the greatest number of people on the planet is actually Mandarin, which is a dialect of Chinese. Other languages that are widely spoken are English, Spanish, and Arabic. Thanks to the British Empire, English is spoken on every continent, while Mandarin has more people speaking it. We may tend to think of language in print form. For most of history and for most of the world, language has been or is spoken orally. More than half of spoken languages have not even been put into written form yet. The study of language can really be controversial. If you're in education or social sciences or maybe English major, you'll somewhere in your college career come up against this truth. While we use words every day and don't think about it, scholars in different fields concern themselves with how we choose words, why we choose words, what effect words have on us, and how the powerful people of the world use words. One theory of language, general semantics, says that meaning resides in the person using the word. Not in the word itself, but in the person using the word. It's helpful for us as a public speaker to keep this in mind, especially in regard to denotative and connotative meaning. Let's kind of define what denotative and connotative meaning are. Denotative meaning is the specific meaning associated with the word. This is your dictionary definition. We sometimes refer to denotative meanings as dictionary definitions here, but the scientific definitions provided for something would be a denotative definition. Connotative definition is more about the relationship and the context of where something is being stated. So connotative language, let's use sarcasm as an example. Let's say you have two individuals that are friends and they know each other and they use sarcasm to communicate compliments. Maybe that's something you do. With that sarcasm, someone says, gosh, you just made a 95 on your test. You need to do better. and they roll their eyes. Because you and your friend know that that's actually a compliment, you take it as such. But if someone on the outside listening to that conversation may think, well, that's awfully cruel. Language has different layers of definitions. You'll always have a denotative definition and a connotative definition. Language also evolves. Some words have more than one meaning. Let's just take the word blue. That can mean a state of depression. It can mean an indication of winning, like a blue ribbon. It can mean a sudden event, something that's happened out of the blue. Or it could mean that it's in a plural form. It could be a genre of music, the blues. Or it could be a color. Language evolves. Some of the definitions we had for words 5 years ago, 10 years ago, are not definitions we have today. But language is not just something we use. It's really a part of who we are and how we think. When we talk about language, we have to use words to do so. So language is hard to separate from who we are. It's hard to separate from our identity because language helps us to craft our identity. We all have our own way of expressing ourselves. Even more, it's almost impossible to separate language from thinking. Not only is language about who we are, it's about power, or at least it is used by powerful people. In fact, some educational and political theorists believe that language is all about power. Let's look at euphemisms as an example. Euphemisms are language devices that are often used to make something unpleasant sound more tolerable. Let's look at a well-known example of a euphemism. What's the difference between the word air support and bombing? They mean the same thing, but the word air support would be seen as a euphemism that is really trying to change the perception of what's actually taking place. Even today, words like revenue enhancement can be used instead of tax increases. The word revenue enhancement is a euphemism. There was an old saying, and it came from the 1988 election debate between George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis. And in this debate, it was mentioned, he who defines the terms wins the debate. There's so much importance about defining those terms and understanding those terms and making sure your definition connects with your audience. There's an understanding of that. So let's look at some of the standards of language. There's a difference between abstract language and literal language. To examine the difference here, let's look at an example. Let's take the word art. If I mention the word art, some of us may think of painting, some of us may think of poetry, some of us may think of dance, some of us may think of short stories. This word art really evokes many different images in the minds of your audience. That art is an example of abstract language. Abstract language is language that evokes many different images in the minds of your audience. Let's say, for example, we were really wanting to talk about sculptures, so we said art. There's still too much left to interpretation there. So we could say visual art, but that's still a bit abstract. We could say three-dimensional art, but that's still abstract. What if we said a marble sculpture? More than one marble sculpture. We could say a Baroque sculpture, more than one Baroque sculpture. Or we could look at Bernini's sculpture of David. That is very specific language, and Bernini's sculpture of David is not abstract, it's very literal. You'll see in your textbook there's a ladder that actually does an example of this on page 198. That may be something you want to look at as well. Figurative language has two types of forms. We have similes and metaphors. Simile is a figure of speech involving the comparison of one thing with another thing of a different kind. And we're going to use the words like or as. The wind is like a howling wolf. That's a simile. Maybe you would like to take some time and write down an example of a simile that you can think of. We use them all the time. Metaphors are figures of speech that identify something as being the same as some unrelated thing for rhetorical effect. We highlight similarities between two things. Love is a battlefield. Is love an actual battlefield? Not really, but we're comparing two things there. Now, we also have sayings that are overused expressions. These are called cliches. Maybe you've heard the term, "Oh, that's just cute as a button." That's a cliche. If life brings you lemons, make lemonade. That's a cliche. Cliches can help when used sparingly because it connects to something, but also make sure that you're not overusing cliches. Imagery is another element of language. As I was preparing for class, I was reading Maya Angelou's speech at the 1993 presidential inauguration on the pulse of morning. And in this poem that she wrote for the 93 inauguration, she begins talking about this tree. And she paints this picture of a tree, which is very fascinating. With imagery, we want to make sure that we have sensory language. With sensory language, we want to allow our audience to see, smell, taste, hear, and feel something. Think of the word dog. We probably all have different images that we see when we say dog. What if we said the golden hair dog that gracefully runs around the yard? We see something different. Or the bold chihuahua that barks loud to let everyone know that he is here. That's a different image. This idea of imagery, you'll also see it in a lot of poems. I mentioned On the Pulse of Morning earlier as an example. So I'm thinking about the poem Daffodils by William Wordsworth. He would say a host of golden daffodils, or beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. You're providing these images. In addition to images, there are certain types of language that are intended for certain audiences. Think of jargon. Jargon is a specific field of language that may or may not be understood by others. So, for example, if we're in cosmetology, you may hear the word jargon and you can think of specific words that relate to your field, like a fish hook. A fish hook is a type of curl. If someone outside of that career path heard the word fish hook, they probably wouldn't be thinking about a type of curl. For those of us that have served in the military, we can think about jargon. Just think about the word MOS, abbreviation MOS, military occupational specialty. And I'm sure there's many more that you can think of as well. So that's jargon. There's a difference, though, between jargon and slang. Slang is a type of language that consists of words and phrases that are specific to a subculture or group that others may not understand. The whole point of slang is for a subculture to have its own code, almost like secret words. But once slang is understood by the larger culture, it's no longer slang and it's simply classified as informal or colloquial language. Bling was slang at one point, but now it's in the dictionary. Sports have a great deal of slang used by players and fans that now get used in everyday language. Let's take, for example, that was a slam dunk. You hit a home run. They may not be referring to the actual sport, but they're referring to something successful. When thinking about your audience, and this is a scenario I want us to think about here. Sometimes we have complicated vocabulary. Use language that your audience understands. I may use the word recalcitrant in my speech, and some audience members may know the meaning or figure it out, but many would not. It would make much more sense for me as a speaker or you as a speaker to use a word readily understandable. Stubborn. The words stubborn and recalcitrant are very similar. Or I could use the word parsimonious, which means simple. It's good to have an extended vocabulary to know when to use which words where, but always be thinking about your audience. This next type of language I really want to stress should probably stay away from professional settings. That's profanity and cursing. That's typically not looked well upon in a professional setting, and it can actually hurt your credibility. So stay away from profanity and cursing there. Finally, today we're going to be looking at some rhetorical techniques. This chapter and our discussion today is really like a toolbox, and we're going and outlining different tools we can use with language. So we're going to look at some rhetorical techniques that can help improve our presentations, specifically with language. The first tool we have is assonance. Assonance is the repetition of a vowel sound in a sentence or passage. So you're going to use vowel sounds over and over and over again to relate. And that's something you'll want to look for when you're watching this week's speech. Alliteration is the repetition of initial consonant sounds in a sentence or passage. The I have a dream speech did this very well. I can give you a quote from that really looks at alliteration. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not only be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Next is antithesis. 1960, John Kennedy's, JFK's inaugural address, he used this quite a bit. And you probably know this quote, but it was, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. In that speech, he also gave another example. If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, It cannot save the few who are rich. That's antithesis as well. Parallelism is another tool we can use, which is the repetition of sentence structures. It can be useful for stating your main ideas. Maybe you're familiar with the statement, give me liberty or give me death. That sounds much better than give me liberty or I'd rather die. The first one sounds a lot better there as well. Then anaphora is another tool. We have two more tools to talk about. Anaphora is a succession of sentences beginning with the same word or groups of words. And in his inaugural address in 1961, JFK began several succeeding paragraphs. I just love that speech. And it says, to those old allies, to those new states, to those people. He kept using the words to those. That's an example of anaphora. And finally, we'll end today's discussion with looking at hyperbole. Hyperbole is intentional exaggeration for effect. Sometimes it's for serious purposes, other times for humor. Commonly, hyperbolic language is used in our everyday speech to emphasize our emotions. Such as you may say, I'm having the worst day ever, or gosh, I would kill for a cup of coffee right now. Neither of those statements are true, but it stresses to others the way you're feeling. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan at the time was one of the oldest presidents, and he often made fun of his age, and Ronald Reagan really used humor effectively. One of the examples I have about like him using age, in one case that the chamber was celebrating their 70th National Chamber of Commerce, their 70th anniversary, and Ronald Reagan got up and said, the chamber is celebrating an important milestone this week, your 70th anniversary. I remember the day you started. The crowd laughed. And it was a way of him using humor. And he did that very well in multiple occasions. So today we've looked at a lot of tools that we have. We have looked at rhetorical techniques such as assonance, alliteration, antithesis, parallelism, anaphora, and hyperbole. This week, we're going to be working on analyzing a speech by Maya Angelou. I want you to look at these rhetorical tools, and see how she uses those.